I have a fly that flew into my house that if you see me going like this. I got it. Never mind, no more fly.
Okay, it says we are streaming, so we should be good.
Okay, I call to order this June 11th meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:08 p.m. We're going to skip the approval of minutes because we do not yet have a quorum and move on to citizens to be heard if we have any. Summer.
I have nothing.
All right, that was easy. We have a discussion item tonight, 4.1, a presentation from staff on updates to the Walnut Lane project. I assume that is you, Caitlin.
It's me. Happy to be here. I just wanted to come before the Planning Commission because most of these conversations have been happening with the council. And so I wanted to bring you guys up to speed on the Walnut Lane redevelopment project. Just quickly, we have selected a firm, which is Architectural Squared. And so I wanted to give you a quick overview about that process. We published an RFP for master planning and pre-development services to kind of get the city through creating a master plan, figuring out a pro forma, looking at financial and other logistical problems with this project that we know that are going to come up. So we published that RFP back in December and closed it in late January, on January 30th. We received 10 bids for that proposal and went through, we had a committee that included myself, Nora and Corey, Joel, Barry Ellison, who's our building inspector, Chuck Williams, the engineer, and Mike Duncan as a council representative. And so we went through that process and reviewed the 10 applications, narrowed it down to 5, and then interviewed those. Actually, we narrowed it down to 4, and we did in-person interviews with those. We selected Architectural Squared for a few reasons. First of all, they were the highest ranked from the ranking system that we created to review the written proposals. They were the highest ranked out of those. They just had a really complete proposal and talked a lot about what we were looking for. We also chose them because they had one of the lower bids, and not to say that lower price, you know, is kind of a balance of, they had a really high quality proposal and also a really high cost value associated with that. And then most importantly, they're a local firm. We had a couple of proposals that were either local, more local and out of scope, or from our region. And so we feel really excited to be moving forward with Architectural Squared because that team is really familiar with the project, even from when the city purchased it, and they brought really innovative ideas about public engagement and some of the ways to bring in the residents and the neighbors to create a project that everyone in the community is going to be really excited about. Obviously, we select them. Council approved that contract in late April. We selected them in early March. It was before COVID, and so we've had to work with them to figure out how to change some of our public engagement pieces with that as we move forward. So we have been meeting with them weekly, doing weekly check-ins with them since early May, so about a month, and are continuing to develop a master plan. We have some initial ideas, and we've gone through a few phases of amending the master plan, even from the initial proposal that they provided. And right now we are in the process of waiting for a survey to come back, topographic survey from Red Desert, so that we can really start moving forward with a lot of the infrastructure challenges that are going to be on the site, namely with stormwater. That's kind of one of the biggest question marks at this point. We've been talking a lot with Chuck and his office about some of the sewer issues. We have a sewer line that runs to the site, and we're trying to figure out, because it's really old, at least probably 50 to 70 years old. And so we're trying to figure out with our site plan how to move forward with some of those issues. We're also in the weeds trying to figure out parking issues. One of the things that we are, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the night, but one of the big issues that we're running into is the city was intending on using the planned affordable development PAD ordinance to develop it, and we are finding that the parking requirements of the PAD is just really not feasible. And so, yeah, so I just wanted to provide a quick update, and happy to answer questions about the project. We're still pretty early on, but definitely want to make sure that we're including you guys in this process as much as we are with the council. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. Let's see. 4.2, discussion item. Staff presentation and discussion, Planning Commission review, and Incremental Development Alliance workshop presented to City Council. Corey, I assume that is you.
I think, yeah, we'll do a little bit of a tag team with Caitlin, throwing her back into this. She was the point person bringing this to the city, but essentially this was a presentation that was brought before City Council and is pretty relevant to the Planning Commission's thought process, how we move forward interpreting development in our residential zones and taking zoning into account for that. So I'll hand it over to Caitlin to explain a little bit more in detail, and then we'll play that excerpt from the City Council presentation.
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, so I partnered with the county, and this was a project that I was working on when I was still at the county and in the planning process of that. And then by the time I moved over to the city, it became more of a joint city-county project. But we were talking with the Incremental Development Alliance to do a series of presentations to the public, including, so we planned it back in March and planned it to have sessions that were more specifically conversations with elected officials and with city and county planning staff and with the public and local developers about how to better incentivize and support small developments in the Moab area. And that, in particular, that session with elected officials was at the same time as the county council's emergency meeting to talk about things related to COVID and shutting down town. And so some of the sessions and conversations we had planned with the Incremental Development Alliance were kind of overshadowed by everything that was happening in the world. And so I have been working with the director of this nonprofit to kind of reschedule that. So yeah, so that's the presentation, and we'll just play that for you from the recording from the City Council workshop session, which was a couple weeks ago, and then we'll have a conversation about the conversations that we had with the City Council. And our goal and Corey's goal is to bring this before you so that we can start having conversations about how to better incentivize small scale development, potentially including maybe the creation of like a PAD light for smaller projects, or amending the city's current PAD ordinance or R3 zone to better incentivize affordable housing. So Corey, I don't know if you want to pull up the YouTube or if you want me to.
Sure. I have it queued up and I've skipped forward a little bit right to where you're giving background. So I'll share my screen here.
Great.
See if this will work for us. Is that working for everyone? Okay, pull it up. This will get confusing with
Should I be getting sound?
Yeah, Corey, I think that you might need to fix something in the Zoom settings so that it plays the audio from your computer and not from you talking.
right. Summer, I'm not sure if you have a quick link to how that might
I do not.
function. This was one of my fears, is that
There's
audio
a
wouldn't
view option
translate.
at the top. Does that show up for you? It might be in there.
If you take your headphones out, what does it do?
Yeah, we'll try.
Or had a specific talk with elected officials, and Mayor Emily and Kaylin were both at that, but it was at the same time that everything was changing really quickly with COVID. So that event didn't go as planned, and so I really appreciate Jim and Neil taking the time to reschedule that. A couple of months, Jim and Neil and I have kind of revamped the presentation to make it a little bit more specific for this council. And so that's my brief introduction. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim and he'll kind of walk you through the presentation.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having us tonight. I shared my screen, so that shows up as expected. Yes. Great.
It looks good from my end.
All right. Well, what we have done tonight, working with your planning staff, is just identify a couple of things to talk about. Obviously, there's not a tremendous amount of time. We want to have a good opportunity for some discussion. So I'm going to walk through about 20 minutes of presentation, a little bit of warm up, and then right into sort of an example of a project that we did a basic amount of what we like to call spot testing. Neil spent quite a bit of time, my colleague Neil Heller, in Grand County and with prep before he came on his trip in March. And so we were able to use that intel to dial in a little bit deeper in one particular area of the city that appears to be working on some being able to work on, hang on a second. Oops, hang on a second. So to be able to work on, in particular, the R3 area of your city, the zoning classification, and some other modifications to that area. And so I'll start a little bit about us, and then we'll go into that example, and we'll go from there. All right. Oops, start this up here. Here we go. Zoom slideshow. There we go. All right. Well, a little bit about the Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization based here in Minnesota, where I'm at, but we work across the country, our board and faculty, to provide small-scale developer training, as well as technical assistance to cities, counties, governments, nonprofits who are interested in having small development happen in their place. So that's in part how we found ourselves in Grand County and Moab here this spring. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is this scale of building, this 1 to 3 story scale of building. And it's mostly residential, but mixed use, as well as the kind of building that is found in every place. And we typically like to work at the neighborhood scale because that's the building block of every place, whether it is a small rural town or a big metropolitan city. The neighborhood scale, these 1 to 3 story buildings, is typically what makes most of our country today. And so this scale of buildings is what we're going to talk about, and in particular, a subset of those buildings that is really appropriate for your city. And so we represent, as an organization, through a nonprofit lens, of course, the idea of what does it take to be a small scale developer, someone who might build or renovate a building like the one you see on your screen. And so whether you're a small developer or any kind of real estate developer.
Hold on, Jim, can you hear me?
Yes.
When you went to adjust something, I think we lost your screen share.
Oh, okay. We'll restart that.
No worries. I did hear a child's voice.
Yes.
So I blame a lot on my child these days.
I have 3 screens, so it's possible that when I stop, oh, there we go. That's it.
You can see it now.
Okay. I must have stopped the share instead of stopping the audio. There we go.
Okay.
Okay. You didn't miss much yet. This is what you missed. You guys can see the buildings now? Great. Okay. Those are the buildings I was talking about for the last minute or so. Anyhow, we'll move inside the mind of a small developer. And so really there's a couple of key questions that you have to ask yourself if you're looking inside the mind of the developer in a place, and in terms of what are they looking for in a project. So tonight I'm going to play the role small developer coming to Moab and saying, you know what, I've read some of your rules, I've read your lovely comp plan, I've talked to some people in your city. There seems to be some opportunity here for me to do great work and to be a part of this community in doing that work. And so the two questions that need to be answered off the bat: is there a reasonable profit ability? I didn't say large, but I said reasonable for the effort. There has to be a balance between what you can do to make money, because real estate projects can't lose money. Otherwise, you'll be a former small developer very quickly. But also there has to be, for taking risk, which is the second question, how do you balance risk with reward? And so if you're trying to do that, you're trying to find different ways where risk can be minimized. And so the ability for risk to be minimized is of utmost importance for a small developer, because if you're a one-person team, the ability for you to handle risk is very small. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. And so in short, what usually happens is, in order to find a reasonable way to be compensated for the effort, that is the path that has the least amount of risk, you take the path of least resistance. And so part of the spot test today that we're going to look at is finding what is possible within one particular set of your rules in the city, and what is possible within that. And we're bringing a sort of an outside perspective to that, to say we're not necessarily looking to say, okay, well, we're going to look at the rules and see what's possible. We're going to look at some things that try to meet your goals as a city, whether it's in form or in financial considerations, and see what would be a good fit for reaching those objectives. And then we'll work backwards to see how that fits within the rules by which some of those places might be governed. So we're going to sort of follow that path of least resistance to see what we find. But first, we're going to see what meets the market, what meets the desires of your place. And so we've done a little bit of work to shape a couple of those assumptions for the purposes of the conversation tonight. Now, I will preface this with saying that this has not been deeply researched. We have talked to people locally. These are not numbers out of thin air, but they're also not done from a comprehensive study or a large endeavor. So we're going to basically set up a couple of assumptions, and we're going to follow those assumptions through as a way to illustrate relationships between numbers. That's really what we're going to be able to accomplish in 20 minutes tonight. And so we wanted to set a couple baseline thought processes. For those of you who don't spend your days doing real estate math, we wanted to talk about a couple of things that are important, like what can people afford? So through a conversation with the planning staff last week, we said, hey, here's some general baselines for if somebody makes $15 an hour or $19 an hour or $30 an hour, here's what that translates to their income. Here's how that translates into potential rents that household might be able to pay. Now, this is not a judgment on do these numbers work or not in your community. there's a lot of different opinions about perhaps what is affordable, what is not affordable. We simply wanted to be able to have ready reference for, well, someone making X amount of money per year, X amount of money per hour might be able to afford reasonably this amount a month in rent as a way to sort of anchor the conversation. And in this case, we use the assumption of using 33% of the income towards housing costs. And again, you can debate whether that's too high or too low in terms of what people should be spending on their housing, but we made that assumption. We're just going to work forward from that. And you can understand up or down from there where things may fall if they were more or less than 33%. So another thing we wanted to do was to be able to have building shape and building performance be within a thought process that makes sense for Moab. And so we've heard a couple things. One, that there is a preference for buildings that are 2 stories or less, that there is a preference for site layouts that maximize sustainability and energy and water considerations, and that there is a need for land development in the city to be able to be financially viable, which is to say pay for itself, right? There's infrastructure required in order to make land be viable, and that land needs to be able to produce enough productivity so that it can pay for that infrastructure, whether that's the actual soft costs of people employed by the city or the hard costs of pipes in the ground that make the actual land possible. All those things need to be paid for in the course of the work that you all do in running the city. And so being able to measure how that happens on a parcel by parcel basis and compared to how do different types of scenarios produce more or less for the infrastructure that's largely fixed in the ground. Regardless of what you put on a site that's 100 feet wide, the costs to serve that site are going to be largely the same because the infrastructure is already there or is going to maintain a consistent value. So what we want to talk about briefly to preface this is to be able to talk about thresholds in particularly small real estate projects. Most larger real estate projects really kind of fall under one set of financing and one set of building code considerations. Smaller buildings have a tendency to straddle these lines. And so within 1 and 2 unit buildings, a residential building, those are largely, I should say, represented or regulated by the International Residential Code. And anything that's 2 units and above or 3 units and above is regulated by the International Building Code. And so the ability for being able to understand those pieces of the puzzle are important in order to move forward with understanding how there are costs and different ideas set behind in that process. I gotta make an adjustment here. So the other thing to understand is about financial mechanisms. There is a very prevalent mechanism we have in this country called a 30-year mortgage. How does that mortgage work? Well, it represents buildings that can be 1 to 4 units in size. So most people probably don't know that actually a 30-year mortgage is able to be used for building more than a single unit. Anything more than 4 units, though, falls into the residential into the financial code for residential buildings. For commercial buildings, I should say. So the ability for excuse me for a second here. Jack, can you go downstairs, please? Yeah, excuse me for a second.
While we're paused here, how's the volume for everybody? Okay, thumbs up. Okay.
So one of the things to note about small buildings, of course, is that while they're regulated by the building code and regulating by conventional financing mechanisms, there is yet zoning on top of that. And so unfortunately, zoning doesn't seem to always fit well in being able to have everything lined up between the building code that governs costs, and the financing mechanisms that help make the project go forward. And so today we're going to talk about how does your zoning code in some ways fit or not fit around some of these mechanisms. This is just a brief sort of breakdown of how different attached and detached structures can be utilized together. So for instance, you could have more than 5 units on a lot, but if they are in single buildings, none of these need sprinkler systems. If you attach all those buildings together, like up over here, you have multiple units on one lot. Now you need a sprinkler system. It's the icon up here in the corner. And so understanding how we can maximize the ability to have different configurations of buildings also allows us to control costs. And in a place that has high construction costs like you all have, that's a great way to be able to lean in a little bit and find some cost savings where possible. So we're going to get right into your examples now. One of the things we like to think about in terms of building types is that they're a little bit like bikes, right? You have different types of bikes for different types of purposes. One thing that we've learned so far is that you had some pretty good tools on the books for the sort of 1 to 4 unit buildings. And so we're going to focus tonight on the 5 to 12 unit buildings, and those buildings potentially being on sites that are between 7,500 and 15,000 square feet. As it turns out, there is a great number of lots, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that are in the R3 zone or could utilize your PUD process. You also have a PAD process that has some pretty good zoning rules within it to help incentivize and encourage development. But one of the challenges from the perspective of a developer is that all of those, being able to opt into those rules requires some site-by-site negotiation. And so that can bring uncertainty to the process of figuring out how will a project move forward. And while there's great reward, in some ways there's great risk. So we were able to perform a brief analysis of some of the opportunities to say, well, how many sites do you actually have of a certain size in the community? Because it's great to think through, hey, we like to have this, we like to have that, but you have to be able to land those ideas on real lots and real sites. And so we saw there's a sweet spot in the possibilities within your city by looking at all of the R3 zone sites and saying, gee, there's quite a number of sites here that is about 1/4 of an acre. And so we're going to look at a site that's just slightly larger than that. It happened to be something that we already had that sort of laid out well in this zone. But you can see within the 10,000 to 15,000 square foot lot range that there's quite a number, sort of the greatest number of lots that are at least zoned R3 in your city to work from. And so being able to find a solution for lots of this size is really important because you have a lot of them to go around. And so finding something that fits is going to be a really useful exercise to look at for your place. So we were able to work with the planning staff and sort of locate an area of the city where there was a lot of R3 sites. One of the things about your city, besides the fact that you have the core of your city has these very regular shaped square blocks. However, within each one of those square shaped blocks, you have very irregular lot sizes, configurations, shapes, and forms. And so one of the challenges behind a zoning code is to figure out how to take what is otherwise a fairly straightforward pattern, right, of blocks without alleys, and be able to say, okay, how do we make a consistent and predictable and character defining way of buildings to meet the street and be a part of the block? So just understand the fact that your place is not going to be as regularized as the example I'm about to show you, but in order to be able to make sort of head-to-head comparisons, we took one fairly regular shaped set of lots and was able to sort of repeat them. And they probably would fit in sort of the scale of lots that you're seeing right here in the center of your screen, some sort of configuration and proportion and size. A lot of your lots are fairly deep and probably much deeper than the exact example I'm about to show. So just to give a sense of that, this lot's probably, this longer lot here is probably a little bit deeper and a little bit narrower than the lots that I'm about to show here next. So this is a balancing act of being able to get your physical and aesthetic desires with the financial and cost issues that go along with those. So we're going to examine those right now. So the lot that you're gonna see here in a second is 100 feet wide and 135 feet deep, which is then 13,500 square feet. And again, as I said before, these are baseline assumptions to get order of magnitude. These are not exact, even though the numbers look very specific. The rents look very specific. The construction costs look very specific. They are largely there to be held in place across all of the examples so that you can understand what changes and what remains the same. And we didn't go over 2 stories in any of the examples. So first off, we decided to see what a baseline thought process would be. And so for a 13,000 square foot lot in the R3 zone, we started with sort of the R3 as our baseline because there were so many lots of this size. And we found out that at 2,000 square feet of lot requirement per unit that you want to build, this would allow us to have 6 units. So we simply found a way to put 6 units, none of which were attached more than 3 together, because if we attached more than 3 together, then this complex of buildings would need a sprinkler system. So we have 2 and 1 and 1 and 2. And therefore, this can be built under the International Residential Code, the IRC. And so these all happen to be 2-bedroom apartments. We thought there was some additional flexibility in showing that. You could reconfigure these buildings to be a series of 1-bedroom apartments as well. But there are some challenges to that, largely having to do with parking and some other things. And so the 2-bedroom apartments were the most efficient to be able to be closer to meeting those requirements, even though in some cases they exceed these. So again, these examples, we're going to show you these next 4 slides. We weren't so worried about following the zoning rules on the books because there are multiple different zoning pathways. We were first trying to figure out, hey, what would make sense? What is a building that actually financially performs in a way that somebody would be able to invest in it and to be able to get that reward for their risk? And just see if we can make good form and make a good neighbor. And so this is sort of our baseline 6-unit building. And so one thing I want to note down here is the cost of investment capital. So one of the things that we just set a baseline at was to say, if we had 10%, this is a time-adjusted return. So not to get too deep into the weeds, but this is a typical way that someone making an investment in real estate would evaluate how good a deal this is for their cost or for their investment. And so a typical investment return for a multifamily housing project of this size might be 10, 12, maybe more percent, maybe 15. And so we took a very modest 10% just to see what that would yield us. And for this 6-unit building, we saw that the rents for each of the units would need to be about $2,100 to $2,200 a month in order to achieve that return. Now, we also then said, well, what would happen if you were to add a second story? What would that do? Would adding more units of housing be able to, on the same sort of fixed costs of land and infrastructure, would that yield a better rent? And turns out, as you add more units, there was enough spread between the cost of construction and the revenue that to achieve that same cost of capital, that same return for the investment, we were able to lower the rent. So it's about $2,100 and went down to just under $1,900, right, $1,885. So there was some affordability goal, some affordability met by being able to have a few more units. And the question is, how far? Now, we didn't increase the amount of parking. We didn't increase the amount of open space. We just simply said, all things the same, how much more affordable could the building be with more units for the same cost? So I'll note that many of these things are not compliant with the R3 zone once you do that, particularly, first off, the number of units and also the number of parking spaces. We'll talk about more of that in a future slide about how that plays out and how to get to compliance from here. Now, one other thing that we wanted to look at was, what if we worked at it from a different direction? What if we worked at it from saying, we would like to have a target rent of $1,200 to $1,400 a month for a new construction 2-bedroom apartment? And that's probably a little bit on the low side. That's probably very much similar to maybe a much older building. And in most cases, you'll expect that a new construction building will probably have slightly higher rents than a building that's maybe been around for several decades. But we just picked these numbers and said, okay, well, what would it take to do this? Well, it turns out that $1,200 to $1,400 a month rents do not produce 10% returns. They produce, in this case, 1.5% returns. So it's highly unlikely that someone who is motivated to use dollars in a way that will bring them a risk-adjusted return will actually do this project, because the return is quite slim for the risk they would have to take. Now, that doesn't say that there aren't institutions, or perhaps yourself as a city, who might say, you know what, we're not looking to make a lot of money here. We're looking to be able to invest patient capital. And in order to get rents that we've described, we wouldn't mind a transaction that just made a little bit of money, enough to cover the transactional costs of doing this, and to be able to get a return and get our money back and do it again, perhaps. So we wanted to show you how this building would look like under maybe a more nonprofit developer scenario that is looking to achieve the rents here. Now, what happens if we're able to add more units, then, you might say? Well, we're actually able to increase that return. And thus, you could probably imagine, if we wanted to decrease the rents further or have a mixture of rent rates, that having additional units would help you do that. That's probably no surprise. Now, here's the problem. As I already mentioned, there are one or more fatal flaws to each of the four buildings I just showed you in terms of meeting requirements within a single set of rules in one rule set. So you have sort of opt-in scenarios that you can negotiate some of your own rules within the PUD and the PAD rules. And then you have the baseline zoning for your R3 zone. Now, taken as a whole, there are some really great rules and really great possibilities within each of those three rule sets. The challenge is that the best parts of each of them aren't in any one package. And so achieving compliance and being able to both maximize the efficiency of what you're spending for the costs, what you're achieving in revenue for the cost, as well as getting these percentages and thresholds right for how many square feet you need per unit. What is the maximum density allowed? What is the amount of parking required? How do you get that to be lessened? How much open space is required? And so these are a couple of things that we were assuming that need to be achieved, or within some of the rule sets we might be able to actually get to and be able to bring this building to compliance. However, there were some things that we really couldn't get around. So what this drawing is showing is the difference between, I'm going to flip forward for a second. This is the baseline building I've been showing you, the size of the site, a 13,500 square foot site. In order to achieve compliance with most or all of the rules that are most prominently found, the site that had this site having 12 units of housing on it would be required to be this much larger. So instead of being 100 feet wide and 135 feet deep, it would need to be 178 feet wide in order to achieve the proper things here shown in red: lot coverage, units per acre, or landscaping coverage. The lot would have to be closer to 24,000 square feet in size, which is about half as much larger than the original site. When you buy more land, because you need to meet these requirements, your land costs go up. So this is an additional $234,000 of the value of land, assuming every square foot is the same in value, in order to achieve the area necessary to put the 18 parking spaces in, and to achieve the remainder of the open space requirements and other requirements in order to fit 12 units on a site. So we wanted to compare that and to say, well, if we had to buy that much more land, that has to be paid for somehow. And so if we were targeting rents of $1,200 to $1,400 a month at 3.5% return, those rents would have to go up to being $1,400 to $1,500 a month, or to get the same return. Or if we were actually working in those earlier scenarios where we were working using market rate capital at 10%, those rents would have to go up several $100s. So largely, the baseline here is to say that between $200 and $250 a month additional cost could be required in order to, or would be required in order to take a building that fits on this footprint and actually make it compliant. And so this is taking one very nascent snapshot of understanding what some of the financial implications are to zoning rules. When more sites are required, when more areas required, that has a cost, and that cost can be quantified. And so any of these numbers, whether it's the cost per square foot of construction or the land value, any of these numbers could be adjusted, and perhaps a different assumption could be made. But for this circumstance, holding all these constants all the way through allows us to say, well, there's at least this order of magnitude, perhaps 20% of financial value that is being essentially eaten up through administrative requirements. And so this is once again becoming a balancing act. How do we balance the aesthetical and physical needs of a building with the financial costs and the financial incomes of the building? So basically, in closing, I wanted to essentially just highlight that does the lot that we were looking at, the baseline lot, there's 177 total lots. And so within that is quite a large pool of potential parcels, because of course, you don't get a chance to, as a developer, just order up the exact size parcel you would like to have in order to make the most efficient zoning layout, right? You have to work with the parcels you have. One of the things that was an aha moment to us as we looked at that final example and how much more square footage should be required to put 12 units on a lot in your city, we then have to move forward to a different zone of lots, right? We go from having 177 lots to having just 53 lots that actually are in the 24,000 square foot range. And so there'll be fewer opportunities. Maybe there'll be more competition for those lots. There won't be. But it's important to understand that where you have an opportunity and where your rules start to lead you may create situations where you need more larger size lots than maybe you have a prevalence of. So maybe the right answer in Moab is not a 12-unit building. It is not a 6-unit building. Maybe it's an 8-unit building. Maybe there's a sweet spot. You get fiddling with these things, turn the dials up and down.
Hey, Becky, if you wanted to chime in.
I do. So in relation to what he was saying about parking, that's kind of something I was talking about kind of when I first got on planning commission, I think, is we have all these huge roads. We could remove a lot of these parking restrictions for housing and utilize the roads, with in-street parking or, rearranging parking. I just wanted to point that out because that's such a huge barrier for people to have enough land for the buildings for it to financially make sense and have all the parking. I just wanted to say that. I got really excited when he started talking about that.
I think clearly based on even Caitlin's presentation, that was a barrier for the city itself utilizing the pad, which I think is ridiculous. Also, it just doesn't reflect the way things are now. Not everybody has a car, period. A lot of people have more. I don't think we're gonna, have any more or less street parking issues because, I think it all comes out in the law.
Well, look at 4th East. Look at all these roads. They're humongous. There's plenty of room to rearrange and make parking so people can build, on this R3 and some R4. So anyway, I just wanted to say that while he was talking about that.
Perfect. If anybody else does have a comment they want me to pause the video for, if you want to raise your hand or get my attention, take yourself off mute, something like that, I'll pause the video.
Corey, are we watching the whole? I'm wondering how much time is left so we have time for discussion before everyone has to go.
Right. I think his discussion pretty much does carry through the 50-minute presentation we started a few minutes in. But whatever you would like to do.
So Corey, if it'd be easier to, I have notes from the council's comments and I can summarize. His presentation is only a couple more minutes and then I can summarize the last 15, 20 minutes. So that'd be easier.
It might be good just to respect everybody's time. I know my bandwidth is short watching a video too, so.
Sure thing. So we'll continue until the end of the presentation, and then when he begins the discussion with the council, we'll end this.
That for sure would be great to summarize, Caitlin. Thank you.
Maybe you find what's the right answer for the sweet spot that you have a great prevalence of lots of. This is just to sort of know kind of where you stand and where is sort of an average thought process for a fairly modest developed process for a middle range building, anything between that 5 and 20 units area. We kind of pick the sweet spot in the middle and say, gee, how would this work? So to close, back to those questions we started with at the beginning of the presentation. Where does the risk complement the reward? We looked at different types of return to an investor and developer, and we looked at what kind of financial things we're trying to achieve as a city. How would that work? And one of the big things to discuss amongst yourselves after this presentation especially is what do our rules make a default to? What kinds of things do our rules lead folks to do just out of being the path of least resistance? Are those buildings that come out of that path of least resistance the kinds of buildings we'd like to see a lot of? If they're not, you should probably take a look at your rules. If they are, you can probably ask other questions about why you're not seeing more of them, and that's what you desire. And at the end of the day, this is not about some consultant or out-of-town presenter like myself telling you how much of what should go where. But it's important that you all, as decision makers and stewards of the public, are able to understand that the rules you have, the desires you have as a city as a whole, need to be in correspondence with the actual physical place you have, not the physical place you'd like to have if you could 3D print it from scratch with nothing already currently on the ground, right? You have the city you have, and being able to find rules that are well calibrated to that place. And it's up to you to decide whether a 13,000 square foot lot should really have 2-story buildings or should have 6 units versus 8 units. But it's important to know what your rules do and don't do currently in order to be able to better calibrate what that should be for you all in the future. So in closing, money plus people plus rules make small development. Those are the 3 things that have to mix together. You have to have people who understand how your local sources of capital and how your local rules can combine to make a building or development project. And a small developer in particular operates at an economy of means. They only have so much time, so much money, so many relationships, and they're not looking to maximize every last piece, because a developer working at the economy of scale, right? Maybe he's coming in to put in a couple hundred units, and by that large scale, they're able to find efficiency. Small developers have to find efficiency within rules and within sort of the niches in between. Making sure you don't build a 5-unit building as opposed to a 4-unit building, because you're not going to get any more rent for having to put a sprinkler system in versus not having to put a sprinkler system in. So those thresholds that I mentioned earlier in that 4-square diagram become very important to small developers who are working at those margins to find a way to make the best project. So by testing your rules and by streamlining the path to what you want, small developers in particular, folks who might be building 6 to 12 unit buildings, will most likely not have the ability to make large or say long-term negotiations, right? They want to see something, know it's possible, be able to get a game plan around it and move forward. And they're less likely to come ask for rezonings, come ask for specific negotiated rules, because they only have so much time they can spend to do that before they need to look for a project that can actually help pay their bills. So look forward to questions and discussion on any of this. I'm happy to scroll back through any of the examples here and discuss any of them at the council.
All right, guys, I'll stop the share and maybe bring it back to Caitlin to summarize what some of the council discussion and conclusions were.
Sure. So my notes, first of all,
sorry about that.
So the mayor, first of all, acknowledged just from her own experience that, you know, and exactly what Becky and Kai have already said is that parking is a huge limiting factor in the R3 already for some of the projects that she's experienced. And also she acknowledged the, you know, the sprinklers and impact fees and all of the heightened requirements for projects when you add that 2nd story or if you go above 3 units. So I thought those were all really good points. Mike had a few questions about Jim's opinion on the pad. And his short takeaways, he didn't study the affordability of the pad. He just looked at what you can do on the ground, regardless of affordability with that. But he again talked about parking and brought up the idea of encouraging on-street parking, especially because of the streets, just like Becky pointed out. And, he pointed out that especially with the pad, it's a big problem with developments when you have more square footage dedicated to parking than for buildings. And also briefly mentioned the square footage requirement for units for the pad. He, in his opinion, from looking at it, not looking in depth at affordability for pad projects, but his guess based on what he saw was that pad projects would be good for like 12 units and up. So it's really hard to develop small projects. And then even my experience with working on Walnut Lane, I can tell you that pad is difficult for large projects as well. But that kind of his comments about the 12 unit threshold, I think is an opportunity to talk about creation of a smaller pad ordinance. And then there's a little bit of conversation about vacant parcels in the R3, and based on the numbers that Jim shared and what the analysis that they did, he pointed out that most of the parcels in the R3 are developed, but many of them are underdeveloped. And so, as we start looking at potentially amending the R3 or encouraging more small scale development, there's definitely a lot of room to build out underutilized parcels, not as much vacant land. So overall, the council kind of gave their blessing for the planning department to start moving forward with having discussions about starting to look at these codes and figure out how to improve them. So that's my quick summary. And so I guess that's, I think that this is where I turn it over to you guys. I'd love to hear your overall thoughts and questions from their presentation, and would love to have a conversation about your thoughts about how to move forward with this.
I thought his presentation was great. I think it's good to start the discussion. I think something we should look at, can we do a search by parcel size and kind of figure out where most of those parcels are? And it's probably going to like go between a bunch of different zones. Or another thing I think we should do is look at street widths and follow those streets and kind of make that its own zone, or make an overlay for those streets. Just because if we can utilize less parking requirements on those street fronts, I think we could kind of make that its own zone. Does that make sense? Like 4th East, all these main arterial, not arterial, but like main kind of traveled roads off of Main Street, 4th East, somewhat 1st West, that's gotten a little bit narrower, but we could make a specific zone for the properties that front those streets, less parking requirements because we could utilize the road, and then kind of softly move into the neighborhoods and maybe require a little bit more parking. But I hear from clients in both residential and commercial development that parking is one of the major issues in developing in the city of Moab.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, as far as organizing the conversation, I don't know if we want to do it more formally where we can go around and recognize people, or Kaya, whatever you'd like to do, or we just kind of pop off back and forth. What I'm trying to do now is really take notes on your discussion and some of the points you're making, so I can bring those back to the planning department and we can review those and hopefully create some direction going forward with that.
Caitlin, did it seem like council was pretty on board with the idea that parking was a really big thing that we needed to prioritize? Because I know we've certainly talked about it a lot at Planning Commission, but I don't know how much that, you know, it's always the issue of like, we can all agree, and then as council it doesn't make a difference. So I'm curious if maybe our first push should be to sort of get everybody on board with that.
Right. You know, I think the council is less focused on parking. I will say that the next council meeting in a week and a half, we will be talking about Walnut Lane, and specifically we'll be bringing to them issues about parking. And so I think that if it wasn't on the forefront of their minds with this presentation, I think that there's definitely the possibility to kind of bring that back and kind of put more emphasis on parking. I think the overlay is a great idea. I hadn't thought about that. And I guess, you know, one of the questions that I have with that is, you know, thinking about the city's goal to support affordable housing, would the Planning Commission want that there to be some kind of like deed restriction tie with that overlay, or you know, something like that? Are we talking about two separate issues with parking and with you know, increasing density in the city? Are they tied, if that makes sense? And I don't know, Becky, if you have any thoughts on that, or others. Becky, you muted yourself.
Unmute. Okay, sorry. I think that's another issue with the pad, is all of the income requirements and the deed restrictions that go along with that. It's just too restrictive. I think that we should let the market dictate what people are going to pay. But I mean, even from that guy's, you know, presentation, you can see, you know, by the time you build something, buy the land, you can't be very restrictive with that. It's, unless you're going to totally get rid of parking or go up another story, you know, you're not going to get $600 a month rent for a 2-bedroom unit. It's going to be $1,200 or $1,400 on the, you know, 1.5 or 3% rate of return. So I think it'd be good to start with less and get some projects going, and then maybe once things build up, you could maybe implement something like that. And when I said overlay, I mean more like, I don't really like overlays. I like what that guy said about, sorry, what was his name? Jim. I like how he said make it use by right, because people want to know what they can do. They want to read the code. They want to tell an engineer what to draw. They don't want to draw something speculating that it might be what you like, because that's going to cost 10 grand. So we need to tell people what they can do and then be able to plan for it. So in those, you know, places where the streets are really wide and we could potentially make more parking like in the middle of the street or on the sides of the street, maybe we completely rezone those areas to a special high density housing zone, something we don't even have, something new.
You said the city's not completely focused forefront for parking. If not parking, what are they looking at specifically, especially from Jim's presentation?
You know, I don't want to speculate on behalf of the council necessarily. I think that the context of the presentation and the context of their agenda, we had that as a workshop, and so I think they were thinking more generally about small scale development and I think that they just not as engaged in parking conversations and are really looking at developments specifically in that way. I just don't think that they've heard as many comments about parking as the Planning Commission or individuals on the Planning Commission have.
Wasn't that kind of the summary of that guy's presentation? I mean, you need twice as much land to build.
Yeah, that just wasn't, I think that there, you know, there was some mention about parking, but I think that, yeah, they didn't have a lot of comments or conversation about the specifics about what he talked about.
Wondering if I can jump in here really quick and maybe facilitate 2 points that were brought up. One being that the path of least resistance, essentially the multiple points he made, you can maybe summarize into that one statement: the path of least resistance for these developers is what the product you're going to be producing into your community through that zoning. So one of the takeaways he was asking for the council, and maybe this would be a good opportunity for us as well, is to say, is the type of housing that is being developed something that we're interested in, and what is the issue with it? Clearly we've talked about parking, but maybe not the notes of what makes development difficult, but what the results that are being developed in the community, analyze those a little bit deeper. Does that make sense?
We kind of want to look at what we have as our path of least resistance, and we want
What's
to
happening
we
right
like
now,
that, and
what
what
are those
comes
issues?
from it, and what we can make it into our own direction for the city.
Right.
My takeaway from those meetings when you guys were trying to pass the pad in R2 zone, it seemed like everyone there was really upset. The residents were there, and they were really upset about parking, people parking in front of their houses, people, too much density, too much height, but parking was definitely on the forefront of the residents' concern. So that's why I'm suggesting do this in areas where it's not in a tight little street like Rose Tree or these off streets, and let's make a new zone on the streets that are big and can support parking.
Yeah, I think a lot of us tried to suggest something to that effect with council, and it didn't really gain much traction because that was such a big issue, by saying make it a street by street evaluation about where certain parking requirements or limitations apply, because it makes a lot of sense. Whereas like other places in Old Moab, like I used to live on 300 East, and I mean, we had a literal semi truck, several, bike company Sprinter vans parked along the street on one side, and you still had 3 lanes of traffic basically. So yeah, I think if there's some way, and it sounds like an overlay of some sort would be the best way to do that. So, you had certain things that applied in one area and certain things that applied in another, without having to do some sort of rezone, where if you were to go with the pad, here's the map. If it's in this map, if it's in this quadrant, here's your parking requirements. If it's in this quadrant, here's your parking requirements, that kind of thing. So.
What streets in town are specifically in mind, just so I can get like a better visual representation of where you'd be looking
for where we would require less parking, or for where we might keep like the pad, for example, with its really
less parking, or
so yeah, I think less parking, like anywhere, any of the big, like you can turn a 10 horse team around kind of streets, like by the baseball field, that whole part of town, anything basically between Main Street and 400 East.
North to 300 South, all the way to 4th East.
Yeah, the whole east side of town to 4th East, but not the streets that run perpendicular to Main Street on the other side of 4th East, like Rose Tree or Locust, or those streets that are smaller, a lot of which also have speed bumps or, traffic diversions, things like that. So, but they're all the same zone, which is why that got confusing. There is some R3 in that part of town around the baseball field, but by and large it's R2. So
I really think we should try to incorporate it as a use by right and not an apply for overlay process. I just think that you'll get a better result in people applying, wanting to do things, if they just know what they can do and they can design it, come, with X, Y, and Z done, and they can start their project. People don't want to pay to have a survey done and a site plan done for $5,000 to $10,000 and not even know if it's going to be approved, because it's if you can or can't,
Yeah, I agree, Becky, entirely. I think it sounds like for me, I would say kind of the to-do lists are just genuinely look at our parking requirements zone by zone, and recommend to council that those be changed if appropriate, based on what we're seeing, based on the kinds of impediments we see to things, you know, I remember when the garage company came to town, they almost didn't open because they didn't have the required 2 parking spaces because they have Main Street frontage and an alley, and I think they have to rent them, or they did have to rent them from Wells Fargo from their parking lot. So
Yeah, this is a problem for commercial too. It's a
Yeah.
problem throughout town.
you know, look at amending our zoning, our parking requirements zone by zone, making it a use by right issue. But then when it comes to things like the pad or any sort of high density housing, special accommodations, you know, looking and I would honestly, you know, make that the subject of an overlay if it's something where you could say, okay, you can apply this, and if you're on these streets, this is your parking requirement, and if we're on these streets, this is your parking requirement. I mean, I think that would be decent to do if you apply this planned affordable development ordinance to your development, if you fall into that, because that would have caught, you know, that would have caught the city the right way too when it comes to Walnut Lane, if those parking requirements were changed for those particular streets or for that particular zone, whichever way they decided to do it.
Real quickly for commercial, especially with like the hotspot funding, looking at doing parking down those streets that are right off of Main, does that contribute to how many parking spaces a commercial building or business has to have? If we had a bunch of public parking with the number that a commercial, like a business has to supply, would that go down?
No.
No.
Yeah, not public parking, which is the issue, I think, for a lot of businesses, right, Becky?
Yeah, we need to change it for business commercial too.
Yeah.
With the discussion of use by right, a concept that was brought up was the discussion of pad light. And I think in the council discussion, they might have brought up a little bit more, but it's been kind of brought up that if you were to draft this idea of a pad light, it would be maybe potentially drafted as a use by right. So it's not necessarily written into the zone, but if you were to apply that, so what would I guess I'm just trying to spur a discussion on what your take on that might be, so a mechanism or tool, something like that.
I like the idea of it, especially, I mean, when I joined planning commission, I remember asking, I would ask council members and I'd ask, you know, different staff and like, what's your idea of Moab? And like, what do you want? What's your visual goal for what Moab's supposed to look like? And most people would just say like, look at general plan. And I think that's because we don't have something in place that's like under the idea of what we want to push towards. So like having a pad light, even if it's just, the pad light saying it's just more geared towards the direction, and having something just like Becky said is people want to know what they can do with the options that we're setting available rather than hoping.
And risking thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
So you're talking about doing like an overlay where as long as you meet certain requirements, you're entitled to it and you don't have to go through an application process, or how does that exactly work, Corey?
Essentially, that's exactly right. So it wouldn't be necessarily an overlay in the sense of a locationally driven mechanism, but it could be written in the tool of, if you're going to apply this certain standard, exactly what the pad is, but there are certain elements of the pad that are a negotiation between the city, particularly down to the affordability component. But if you were to take that lighter version with maybe a very clean affordability component, but then the real balance becomes a density versus the benefit to what that development is. So you could really craft it however you'd like, but essentially he's, like he had mentioned, taking what a lot of the good components of different code sections are and maybe compiling it into a smaller section, but having the benefit match that risk. So it's a use by right if you were to apply those additional standards, a lot like we've talked about with development standards in the OA. So if you go to this higher bar, you get this higher level of a bonus, essentially, of whatever it would be. You decide, maybe that's parking, maybe that's the density. It's just something that's a little bit more clear.
Yeah, if I had a comment to that, I think something we've heard about why people are not utilizing the pad is that they can achieve the density. They can basically max out the density in the R3 as is. And so I think, a conversation about, creating a pad light and allowing on-street parking with that would make a big difference in the amount of zoning that could be permitted. I think also making it by right, just as a regular subdivision or a project in the R3 is by right, is a great idea. And also lessening the deed restrictions. I think that even between, I've been looking at the differences in the pad and the affordability bonus in the PUD, and the differences in the deed restriction requirements even between those two are really different. And so with this pad light, I think that it would make sense to consider maybe lessening the deed restriction and making it just for primary residency, or something like that. So I think those.
Starting there is a great idea. Like residents of Moab, like the county did. They've gotten a good response from that overlay. A lot of people are applying, and you can always add more later. If you add too much at the beginning, nobody's doing anything. Just kind of what we're seeing, it seems like.
With the discussion of this pad light, there's a little bit of that element that might yield itself to the possibility of even just revising the pad. Given there was so much effort and time spent into shaping the pad and how that looks, would the council be up for amending something that really took such a battle to get to? That was what the idea of the pad light, of creating something new that is a little bit different, but also currently the pad, I think it's not necessarily a secret that it comes with a pretty severe set of challenges. So I think the idea of planning and zoning is to take a concept and then work it that it's producing for the city the benefits you're wanting, but also it's something that's practical. Otherwise, it's a big piece of code it's sitting in our code unutilized. So it could be that trade-off of creating something new or revising what we have to make it work.
I think revise what we have, take some stuff away. Do a couple things, see what happens.
So I guess a question with revising the pad, I'm just remembering the conversations that we had about that. I think one of the reasons why the county was successful with even some of the really high density that they got included in the overlay was they did a really good job of public outreach. And so I think that's something that we as staff need to do better about. But I'm also curious about the Planning Commission's thoughts on creating basically like 2 levels of a pad. So like Jim suggested that he sees kind of a threshold of like 12 units or larger being one, pad, and then like a smaller pad being for smaller developments. Curious what the Planning Commission's thoughts are on kind of creating 2 different tiers, just because there's so much fear about large parcels being developed with 30, 40, 50, 60 units on them. And I think that there was a lot more fear with bigger projects versus, someone doing a duplex on a lot.
I like that. I like the idea of having 2 separate ones, especially because you have a cutoff that says, after this point, you're not using the pad light anymore. So that makes sense to do.
Doesn't the parking in the current pad really kind of dictate how many units you can get? So you really, even if you're a quarter of an acre, it's pretty applicable. I don't know.
Big component of what the parking requirement is in that pad, the way it's written, is by bedroom, or not by bedroom, by unit. No, by bedroom.
By bedroom.
Bedroom. Sorry, I'm so sorry. So a single bedroom or a studio is required 1 parking space, and then 2 bedrooms or more require 2 or more, versus the R3 is that a 1.5 component. So that's really the function that where you can test, and this will be part of the presentation for City Council, where you can actually computate that and show the difference of what that minor difference makes.
Well, I mean, y'all know my feelings on how the pad turned out with regard to parking and other things, but the fact that the pad would require more parking than the underlying zone would if it was something else is ludicrous. I mean, that seems like so clearly in need of change. But it sounds like maybe doing something entirely different rather than trying to amend that existing framework we already have is the most palatable currently.
Sorry, say that one more time.
Just it sounds like based on the discussion that some sort of pad light or some sort of new ordinance or new accommodation is more palatable currently than just making that slight tweak based on what we're seeing over the last year with applying or not being able to apply the pad, right? It sounds like.
Yeah, I'd like to just see something that works.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to amend what we already have to make it better based on reality, having that hindsight now, but you know, y'all have a good sense of what council is going to do or not do. So if something smaller like the pad light idea is a better one, then that's totally fine too. Ultimately, whatever the mechanism is, I just want it to be something that's workable, that's actually picked to incentivize what we wanted to incentivize.
Yeah, maybe we take the current pad and remove like all the income requirements and make the parking match what, you know, current code is, and then add that it just be primary residence, you know, rather than the complicated income table, and see what happens there. And then you make a new pad light or whatever, you know, that really takes away parking as long as it fronts the street wider than X. And even goes up to 3 stories.
I mean, that to me, that sounds just off the top of my head like a really good idea for a compromise that hopefully, I really do think that having the year of the reality of like, you know, of what just hasn't worked with the existing ordinance will be very helpful, I think, for folks that were opposed to a lot of those kind of things from the outset too. So
one comment just about that concept and how you're kind of massaging that and shaping that going forward is the density component of the pad matched with the affordability. That's the direct relation, is that you can go as dense as you want given you're providing those units. So if you were to take that away and have that essentially unlimited density, you'd be creating more units. So the housing crisis, it is addressing that, but that affordability component isn't necessarily being addressed. So maybe reshaping or recalculating that might be, depending on some of the council members, more palatable as far as protecting that affordable component. But the idea in general, I think, is a good idea.
If you're limiting it to residents only, you know, you're limiting it to the people that live here, the wages that they're receiving, you know, you're fulfilling people that live here and, you know, what they're getting paid. So I think that's more than enough, but that's just me. So.
Yeah, the residency requirement has always been my primary concern. I think that's the biggest threat to stock of housing in town at the end of the day. Maybe not now, who knows, with kind of the economic shape that everything's in, but honestly, maybe more so. I mean, the folks that are hit the least by COVID are the ones who are already in a position to buy a second home. And I would hate to see more property being snatched up just because owners in town have to sell because of financial reasons. By you know, non-residents or folks who don't tend to spend time in our community. So yeah, I like how the county's turned out, and it does seem to be getting used. So I hope it was super helpful for city council to see some of the things that presenter laid out about. I think the most illuminating thing that you probably wouldn't know unless you have a background in development is just that huge difference between the fact that you can add more units to make up costs when you have more units, but when you're below a certain size, it really just totally boxes you out unless there are some sort of regulatory allowances. I think that hearing that put so clearly was really helpful to me even too, so.
Yeah, I think that the kind of Foursquare, he calls it a Foursquare diagram, but this idea of, I think on city side, we're mostly only thinking about the zoning implications of development. And so it was honestly even enlightening for me for him to point out that there's, on the development side, there's also a totally different threshold for financing and for building code standards, and you really have to ramp up your expenses and your risk once you go above 3 to 5 units. So I guess that's kind of a question too of, with the pad light, is there I think this is really great conversation, and I love the two distinctions, and I'm curious if you guys have any ideas of the unit threshold of what a pad light would be versus a pad regular.
The name of this is kind of funny.
Max pad.
I know. Oh.
And all the women laughed. Luke or Ruben, do y'all have any thoughts on any of this? I know it's hard to kind of try to get that 1,000-foot view of everything right now, but I really like that staff seems to be pushing this along, making it a priority. It seems, we've been so enmeshed in overnight accommodations that this has fallen by the wayside. So it's really nice to see it picking back up.
I appreciated it a lot. I really liked the presentation, and it was very enlightening for me. But as for anything else, I like the idea of the overlay of seeing where, he had the setup, there's 177 here, within this size, and like being able to like see that on the map. This is where each of these are. I think that would be very nice. Just for a better understanding of where we can do things, how we can do it, and then that's going to lead into, the shape of the lot itself. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, like anything that we can do to help bring in housing and simplify the process for people to like bring it in, I'm all for. And if that involves like limiting parking and everything, especially once you're in town, that makes a lot of sense to me. Our community as a whole, I see a lot of people like biking around town and everything. And so with how small our town is, I don't see like the negatives of like reducing parking availability. If anything, it can potentially promote Moab to be a little bit more green in terms of transportation around the community.
And I feel like that's probably the push, is as we're going towards sustainable, and we want to be more green, and Moab needs that. I was wondering, as for going about doing a pad light, what's the process? Like, do we start at the bare minimums of like the IBM, or do we look at what we have now with what Moab is and what we're definitely not going to try to push towards? Or what's the process?
The literal process would be a text and zoning amendment, the way you might do a zone change. So you'd be developing a new section of code, a lot like we are with the overnight accommodations. So there's a public process that would follow that, with public hearings and probably work sessions between council and planning. So it would be maybe not extensive, but it would be an elaborate process to narrow what that code section is going to say. I was hoping to circle back to Caitlin's question about what thresholds you guys might consider for that pad light to the current pad. So between, say, 3 and 8 units for that pad light, or is that in the context of 4 to 12 and then 12 and beyond for pad? Just as you're picturing these lots, maybe about density wise.
Well, I guess I was thinking of that backwards. I was thinking pad light would be less restrictions, more density. Is that? Oh, okay. 4.6 units doesn't seem like very many.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like that many. And so I think that's like maybe, you know, going back to Jim's examples, he went up to 12 units on a typical Moab lot. And so I think, you know, 12 could be a really good number, just to incentivize density on a lot of the sizes of our parcels in the R3, especially in like our urban core.
Did he fit 12 on a quarter acre or a half an acre without parking?
I think it was a quarter. He did it by square footage. Let me see. I have it.
Quarter and like
6,892 was the average.
Yeah, so probably about a quarter.
That seems good. 12 units on a quarter of an acre. You know, with plenty of, you know, wide street frontage for parking. Definitely wouldn't want to do that on a little tiny street in a quiet neighborhood. You know, we need to make that clear to people so they don't get upset about it. I think that's the most important thing.
And his example was 2 units or 2-bedroom units, right? The one that he showed.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I would love to entertain whatever staff decides would be the recommendation that will kind of strike that balance. I mean, you all, obviously, you've looked a lot more into this than us, and there's numbers that could sound good to us. But whatever you guys come to the conclusion might be that good cutoff, and we certainly entertain that.
So just to clarify, like currently as like the pad stands, like if we had that like 12 units on a lot, like is it 12 units of like 2-bedroom units? Would that require 36 parking spaces that would need to be allotted for that? It's like 1.5 parking spaces per multiple bedroom.
Is it 1.5 or 2 parking spaces, Corey? Maybe it's 1.5.
One per bedroom?
It's 1 per 1 bedroom. It's 1.5
1 per bedroom.
2. I think it is 1.5. So yeah, it'd be 36 spaces for 12 units, which is.
I don't know. No, that'd be 18. I did some bad math there.
But I mean, just as an example, for Walnut Lane, we're looking at 80 units, and to me, the pad requirements versus the R4, and an additional like 24 units of parking spaces. So
say that one more time. You kind of broke up when you were talking about the parking.
Yeah, so for Walnut Lane, as we're looking at the parking requirements for Walnut Lane, between the R4 and the pad requires an additional like 24 parking spaces compared to the R3. So it's like 120 something parking spaces versus 148.
126 to, yeah, something up there.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, can't it be up to the landlord or developer that, you know, this unit, you can have a car, you have a parking space. If you rent this unit, there's no parking space. Like, do you have to have, are you required to supply a parking spot for a rental, or can you say this one doesn't have parking, you can't have a car if you live here? I don't know.
That's
like,
yeah, up to code as kind of protecting the health, safety, and welfare. The idea of having a parking space associated is kind of part of that concept, but there isn't anything written into law, I don't believe, in Utah State Code. I'd have to check that would mandate parking per unit.
Yeah.
Like a developer could meet whatever their city code requirements were for parking per unit, but then they could park all of their personal vehicles and rent the spaces to people that don't actually live there if they wanted to feasibly, which I've seen in cities. That actually is quite common.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't think there's anything about what they have to utilize. Here in town, there isn't such a premium on parking, so we don't see that here, but yeah.
Would it be crazy to only have, one parking space per unit, even if it's a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom unit?
I don't think so, depending on where it is. I don't think that's crazy at all. I have
For
one.
pad regular.
Yeah.
And
I
the pad
are in my driveway in the R4, and that's sufficient,
Yeah.
Right.
You don't care if I chime in for a minute?
No, go for it, Summer.
So I've had extensive work with the pad, and we tried to go with the 1 parking space per unit. And of course, council struggled with that issue. But one thing you could think about, because they really were looking at probably putting like maybe 3 or 4 units, like say on an R3 lot to begin with, or an R2 lot to begin with. And the employee housing that we have in like the C3 and the C4, if they have employee housing on site, the parking requirement is 0.75. So I'm just wondering if like you were able to do, like you were talking about, a pad light with say 4 units at 0.75 parking spaces per unit. That's 3 instead of 4, and maybe kind of ease into it that way. I know council's big struggle was 1, the parking, and 2, the overall height, and kind of like looking at an infill development sort of project. I know that number of 12 gets them a little scared. That seems like a lot of units on a small piece of property, but I'm almost wondering if you could do something like Caitlin's proposing with like a pad light that kind of does something that's a little bit smaller scale and gets them, gets kind of an example project going, maybe with the 0.75 parking spaces per unit or something along those lines, to like break it in, and maybe it doesn't have the same layer of legislative action on top of that to make it a little bit easier. I'm just trying to throw out some ideas, just because we've talked about this a lot, and it would be great if we could figure out a balance that would help developers and our residents to be able to increase our densities. Not my realm anymore, but just throwing some options out.
You have a little bit of experience.
Yeah, thanks, Summer. I mean, I know that obviously you were involved with PAD for a long time. Do you have, other than parking, do you have any other comments about, there's a lot of public fear about increasing density, and so starting to talk about, potentially going up to 3 stories for this or something. Are there any other comments or cautions as we should be going forward with this?
Honestly, you've probably heard them. I mean, I'm sure you were kind of tracking their conversations as they were going through, and parking and height were really truly the overall fear. That was my takeaway from their discussions, was that parking and height were just the big items. But I think that you have the ability to do something on a little bit smaller scale that could potentially make those numbers work for a developer. I'm sure the higher the numbers, the easier it is to make the numbers work. But honestly, parking has been a struggle. And when we proposed the pad development, it was 1 space per unit. And then through the approval process, it ended up at 1 space per bedroom, which threw it into a whole different realm. Parking is a significant cost and eats up a significant portion of the land. And that has been an ongoing struggle, because we're aware of what that cost is and how much land is taken up with parking. But the fear is that that we'll have hundreds of cars parked in front of one neighbor's house. I think, I don't really know, but there just is that fear, and I don't really know why there's that fear.
Well, when the pad was, being discussed, and it was all of R2, all these people on My Vita, Rose Tree, like they're thinking that a 10-unit building is going to get built next to them, because they have they didn't have a concept of like scale or what the parking requirements were. So they were thinking everybody's going to be on this tiny little street right in front of their house, which I can kind of understand, you know, that's scary. But that's why I think if we focus on these areas with the big wide roads, you know, I think it would be less scary to people.
And those options did come up during council's discussion was, you know, we do have these really wide streets. It's possible that we could have some on-street parking because there are these really wide streets. But again, you're right. I mean, a lot of the neighbors in the R2 were like, wow, that's a lot, that, you know, that's a lot of impact on our neighborhoods. I don't know. Parking has always been a struggle.
Yeah. And height, people don't want something looming over their backyard, but
Even though you could build a 3-story regular house in the R2 right now if you
You
wanted to.
absolutely could. That is a great point, that, you know, you could build a single family residence at 30 feet and loom over your neighbor's single story home without any incentive for additional units. I mean,
Yep. Yeah, I think this is all important stuff that we should really circle back with on council. I think having the benefit of, look, we did what you recommended. We made those sort of broad sweeping exclusions of the R2, the height, with the parking, and it's penciled into something that really is an ordinance in name only. As far as it's being used, I think being able to really be like, all right, you know, we've had this time, no one took the bait. I think with as it's written now, even the city couldn't. I think Caitlin, like that is the most compelling argument. If you could not make that work, when so much of even our discussion in passing the pad was this will be great for Walnut Lane when it comes around, was just like, oh man, come on.
well, and I mean, having a city project that is struggling to even make the concept of the pad work, I think that kind of carries some weight in saying, hey, you know, we tried, we've put some ideas on paper, we've put the numbers, we've penciled it out, and we're not going to get what we need to make it work. I mean, there's just kind of there's already a project in the pipeline that can be looked at, and it is a city project, and they have the ability to look at just some of those barriers that are making it difficult to develop that property.
Totally. Just kind of going back to the conversation about the R2, you know, obviously I don't think that we should be trying to bring the pad back to the R2 at all. But I'm curious about if the Planning Commission has any thoughts about, as we're looking at creating a pad light and we're amending the pad, do you guys want to keep it in the same zones? Are you thinking that you want to only allow it in specific, you know, kind of going back to this idea of only allow certain parts of certain zones? Thoughts on that?
I don't think we should go by zone because it's so random. I think we should look at a parcel map and try to find big parcels. And I think we should look at road widths and drive around and figure it out that way.
I agree completely. I think it being out of the R2 entirely just makes no sense, because the diversity of lots and street sizes in the R2 is about as wide as you can possibly get here in town.
There's so much more of R2 than anything.
I think for me, honestly, my highest priority would be to write the pad in a way where council would agree to allow it to apply in R2, because those are a lot of the parcels we were talking about in our discussion when we were talking about the pad in the first place, was, you know, some stuff over on 400 East, or things that are in kind of the older part of town where, you know, it would be so perfect for development of more of a community neighborhood feel, where they're either just sitting empty or there's a couple trailers on it right now, places that I think a lot of landowners would really want to do something like this. I mean, honestly, my first focus would be to do whatever we need to do to make it palatable and applicable to the R2. Come to that conclusion, because I think just eliminating it from the R2 was just kind of a throwing your hands up at the end of the day and being like, okay, we're going to pass it. So we have to do this to pass it instead of working to try to amend it. But I do want to be cognizant of the fact that it's 7:45 now. We're creeping up on 2 hours for the meeting. I don't know if you all had more on this, but this has been really helpful, I think, to get especially all of the new commissioners on the same page with kind of the history of this and where we need to look at it again.
Real quick then, as for Walnut Lane, where is Walnut Lane in, like, are there problems that need to be addressed with having the pad light, like things that would be like things in mind that need to be changed that could make it better for the development?
So Walnut Lane would definitely be, I mean, we're looking at 80 units. So regardless of the unit threshold, they would definitely be a regular pad. But I think the parking is the biggest sticking point. I mean, the city's committed to income restricting and deed restricting these units, and the pad is the biggest sticking point. So, I mean, in terms of this conversation, you know, this is something that I want to talk about with the council is, do we wait for the city to go through this process to amend the code before going through the master planning process with with Walnut Lane, or does the city develop Walnut Lane just by the R4 zone? That's kind of where we're at, and that's one of my goals with meeting with the council in a couple of weeks to get feedback on how they'd like to proceed with that.
How many parking spots is it going to have with 80 units? Is that 120, 128?
Yeah, I think right now we're at 126. But with the pad, it would be 148. So, yeah. And the plan that we've been working on right now, I think that we definitely would be able to meet the parking requirements for R4 and maybe even provide a few additional parking spaces, but definitely not, there's just not enough room to meet the pad requirements.
You get the same amount of units with R4?
Sorry, say that again.
You get the same amount of units with R4?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I guess, you know, thinking about the parking requirements, another thing with Walnut Lane that we're trying to be really cognizant of is building height with the apartments and trying to create a buffer of, you know, duplex or, you know, townhomes, kind of creating a buffer against the R2 neighborhoods surrounding it. And so, you know, that would be another trade-off of, if the city wanted us to meet, if the council wants us to meet the pad, we're gonna have to build high, tall, dense apartment buildings and not really provide that much green space. But yeah, as R4 is written, we can meet the code right now. So with that, I really appreciate all of the conversation that we have had. Really looking forward to working with Corey and Nora to keep moving forward. And I appreciate you guys having me at your meeting. It's good to see you.
Caitlin, it's always awesome to have you.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you for joining us.
All right, Corey, do you have anything else for item 4.2?
I don't. Thank you guys for participating. I know it was a little tough watching YouTube on the screen, but I think it did spur some really good comments to take back to planning department.
Awesome. What are our future agenda items? Excuse me, tongue-tied.
Right now, I believe the only item we're waiting on is the Nelson Court rezone. We're still waiting on the survey, which should have been accomplished. We're just waiting on the applicant to give that on over to us. And then the overnight accommodation discussion that Nora will be prepping at some point when we have a full commission. And city council and I'm not sure if everyone watched the last city council meeting, but they are discussing when they'll be going back to meeting together as a group. So we'll probably be following in suit with them on that timeline. So those are only things coming up.
Right now, the city council is looking at, as long as we're in the yellow phase, that we'll continue to do this way. And then once we move to green, they'll talk about in person. The problem that we're experiencing right now is that if you're having a public meeting, and there are times when the council chambers can get pretty full, and if you're trying to meet social distancing and, you know, once you hit capacity, then you don't quite have the open meeting anymore, because you're going to have to turn people away, and then trying to keep the commission spread out on the dais. So there are just some challenges that we'll have to work through when we go back into the council chambers. But my understanding from council right now is that as long as we're in yellow, this will be our meeting method.
Can we not meet in person and just broadcast the meeting live, like we're doing right now for the public?
I mean, right now City Hall's not open to the public yet, so that's not, it's possible that we could space it out with 7 commission members. There's not a lot of room at the dais to space everyone out 6 feet apart. The requirement for wearing masks, that makes it a little more difficult to understand what people are saying. So there's just some challenges that we have to work through right now in order to resume in-person meetings.
I understand. I just thought we could maybe meet, maybe not let the public in, but make the meeting available like live so they could watch and interact. Like
they can still watch it on YouTube. It's live right now. So everything is still broadcasting out to the public as you guys are meeting right now. So this is live on camera and people can follow along.
Right.
So the only difference is there's not a council chambers to sit in.
I like meeting in person.
Okay, I think that should be, oh, actually, we do need to go back to item 2.1, which is approval of minutes for May 14th, now that we have a quorum at the end of the meeting. Would be just entertaining a motion to approve those minutes. If anyone has any amendments to make, now would be the time.
I motion to approve the minutes.
All right.
Second.
Oh, who seconded?
Luke.
Okay. Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Summer, we are all raising our hand right now.
I see all of you.
Okay. With that, does anyone have anything else before we adjourn?
No.
All right. Thank you, Corey, Caitlin, Summer, Ruben, Becky, Luke, for coming. Really appreciate it. All right. Meeting is over at 7:55 p.m.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.